Warner Brothers Discovery is splitting into two companies, reversing much of its corporate, product and streaming strategies. We dissect what went wrong and how it got that way. Listen on.
Welcome to this week's edition of Inside the Stream. This is Will Richmond from Video News, and that was Colin Dixon from Screen Media at the top. Colin, been a busy week. How you doing?
It has indeed been a busy week, Will, and I've been smirking at chickens coming home to roost, maybe. I don't know. We're going to have a little bit of a walk down memory lane, I think, today. But we're also going to talk, as we said at the top, we're going to talk a lot about Warner Brothers Discovery because, of course, they made the decision to split the company. But we'll get to that in just a moment. Before we're going to get there, though, I think you're going to climb up on a hobby horse that you haven't been on in a while, but which you've spent a lot of time on in the past, right?
Yeah, today's podcast, for longtime listeners of Inside the Stream and readers of Video News and Screen Media, today's podcast is really going to be a stroll down memory lane because we have a lot of touch points from things that we've both written and recorded in our podcast over the years. But first, before we get to the Warner Brothers Discovery stuff, also important in the news this week was that the arbitration between Disney and Comcast over the valuation of Hulu was finally decided, and that, as many listeners will know, the Hulu valuation was a subject of dispute between Disney and Comcast, and the valuation is what would drive Comcast's final payment to Disney for Disney to buy out Comcast's interest. So I think Disney was saying that the valuation was around $27 billion, which was basically the floor value that had been set by the parties when Hulu was set up. And Comcast was asserting that it was closer to $40 billion. Well, the arbitration came out, and it sounds like it was very close to what Disney had been asserting, because Comcast is only going to pay Disney an incremental $438 million for the share of Hulu that Comcast sold to Disney. So a win for Disney, the valuation of Hulu closer to what they wanted. Comcast didn't get what it wanted here. Just one other, and this is what Colin was saying about me climbing back up on my hobby horse, is that Video News readers will remember way back in the yesteryear days of May 2018, so 7 years ago, I wrote that I believed Comcast should buy Hulu outright. In other words, it should buy out the other two partners, which were Fox and Disney. It should buy Hulu outright. And the argument that I made was that it would give Comcast a national footprint in streaming. It would allow them to avoid future, starting up their own brand. Which is ultimately what they did in starting up Peacock. And I think to date, the last time we talked about Peacock, Comcast had lost something like $6 or $7 billion on Peacock to date. So Hulu really would have given them a big jump start. They could have gotten that share probably for like around $13 billion or so. Sounds like a big number, but for Comcast, actually not that big a number. So there were a lot of reasons. I still believe, actually, that Comcast should have acquired the part of Hulu that it didn't own. But it didn't do that. Instead, Disney ended up being the buyer. And now with the final arbitration done, the full final payment is now in place. Disney owns Hulu. Just one last thing I'll say about Hulu is that it's interesting to think that Hulu was getting started in streaming just after Netflix got started in streaming. And you think about Hulu's valuation now being pegged by the arbitrator at about, give or take, the $27 billion. As we'll talk about in a moment, related to the Warner Brothers valuation, Netflix is now worth over $500 billion. So that's like 20 times, give or take, what Hulu's now valued at. That's pretty amazing when you think about it, that Netflix, it's amazing to think about Netflix's success in general, but just looking at their financial success, their market cap, to think that Hulu and Netflix got going around the same time in streaming, and now Netflix is worth about 20x what Hulu is worth. Pretty incredible, isn't it?
It is incredible, Will. Broadcasters just never recognized the potential, I think, of Hulu. If they had really recognized it, and invested in it, they could have created a product that every home in America would need and would probably be subscribing to right now. They would probably be worth more than Netflix if they had shown a little bit more foresight.
Completely agree, and I think that and this is probably oversimplifying, but I think one of the reasons why they never grasped it or executed on it is that, and this is an old story, but it's really, really difficult for incumbent businesses that have established revenue streams to make the leap into something that essentially disrupts their legacy revenue streams. That's what the broadcasters and the studios were dealing with that challenge. Whereas Netflix, it was all
fresh.
It was all, it was greenfield. It was a totally greenfield opportunity. That's not to say just because it's a greenfield opportunity that a company is going to capitalize on it, but Netflix had a greenfield opportunity and they've executed beautifully at practically every step. Quickster, excluded, obviously, that sort of brain fart moment by them. But other than Quickster, Netflix is just a company that executes phenomenally. And it obviously shows up in what the valuations of these two companies are now.
You bet. Yeah. Apart from the Quickster incident, that as you say, they've executed excellently. But anyway, maybe it's time for us to move on and talk about our main story. Of course, I'm sure our listeners have heard that Warner Bros. Discovery has announced that it is dividing into two. It will become a streaming company with HBO. So I assume that they mean that they're going to be keeping the HBO channel and HBO Max as it is once again now.
Well, and just to interrupt for a second, that HBO, that company also includes the Warner Studio.
It does include the Warner Studios, an important part. And then pretty much everything else, including Discovery Plus, will go into this thing called Global Networks. And so that's what they're doing. You have put together, I thought, a really interesting timeline of what's gone on with Warner Brothers Discovery since its inception. I think that really helps give an interesting perspective. So why don't you walk us through that, Will?
I will, although it's so tortured that our listeners will probably be grimacing by the end. This is quite a corporate timeline when you think about it, but going all the way back to October of 2016, AT&T announced that they were going to acquire the Time Warner business for $85 billion, all the networks and everything else. 2017, the Trump administration opposed the deal. The DOJ antitrust division sued to try to stop it. That suit went on for a while, a lot of back and forth. I think you and I actually did a podcast or two about how we disagreed with the DOJ. We did not think that there was an antitrust. We didn't agree with the logic of AT&T buying Time Warner, but we didn't think that it was an antitrust issue. In any event, in June of 2018, a federal judge ruled that the deal could indeed proceed. They closed the deal in June of 2018. They renamed the company Warner Media. AT&T got $43 billion ultimately from they ultimately got $43 billion. The DOJ dropped the suit. Then what happens next in May of 21 is AT&T reverses itself after spending essentially a year and a half to 2 years fighting with the government to get approval for the deal. They turn around 3 years later in May 21 and decide they're going to spin out the Time Warner assets into a merger with Discovery. That was a company run by David Zaslav, still is, as Warner Brothers Discovery. In May, and so that transaction happened in May of 21. It was announced rather in May of 21, and then now here we are. That deal closed in 22, and now here we are 3 years later. As you said, that Warner Brothers Discovery has announced their plan to split. And I think one thing that's important to note here is that a big issue. We'll talk about the strategic issues about the Warner Brothers and the Warner Media and Discovery transaction from a strategic standpoint, but from a financial standpoint, the company's debt load ran up to almost $50 billion post-deal. And that was really an insurmountable level of debt for the company to hold. And now as part of the split, and they've paid a bunch of that debt down. I think they've probably paid like 15 or 20 billion of that debt down since the deal. But now as part of the split, 34 billion of that debt is going to be transferred to the Global Networks company that you just mentioned. So the other company, the company that will have the HBO assets and the Warner assets, I think, if I read this correctly, is going to be practically debt-free from the get-go. So two very different financial structures of these two companies coming out of this. But that's basically the quick overview of the saga of what's happened with these assets over the past 9 years.
Yeah, I'm going to ask you to do something else. Compare the value of Warner Brothers Discovery back in 2016 with what it is now. That is startling.
Yeah, so as amazing as the comparison of Hulu to Netflix is, the comparison of Netflix to Warner Brothers Discovery is even more sobering. So I think I have the numbers right. Netflix, so we go back to October of 16 when AT&T originally announced the $85 billion plan to acquire Time Warner. That was Randall Stephenson, CEO of AT&T's deal. Netflix in October 2016, share price about $105 per share, approximate market cap $44 billion. Flash forward to May of 25, Netflix approximate share value is $1,200, give or take a 12x increase during this period. Now its approximate market cap, as I said before, is over $500 billion. It's gone from $44 billion to over $500 billion in this 9-year period. Now let's compare it to Warner Brothers Discovery. Now these numbers I think are right, although I'm a little less confident in them because of the transactions that have gone on. But I think back in October of 2016, the Warner deal, Warner at that point was approximate share price $25, approximate market cap $59 billion. Flash forward to May 25, approximate share price $10.50, approximate market cap $25 billion. So we're talking about a market cap decline of approximately $35 billion from $60 billion to $25 billion. I think those numbers are approximately correct. All that happening at the same time as the 12x increase in Netflix's market cap. So pretty stark paths that these two companies, starkly different paths rather, that these two companies have been on.
Very, very stark, very stark. There's one other thing I'd like to toss into the timeline, and that is the machinations that have gone on with HBO Max. When they formed the company, Gunnar Weisenfeld laid out a 3-step plan, and the third step in that plan was the unification of Discovery content with HBO content in a single offering, which they did eventually get to. And when they got to it, they renamed HBO Max, as it was then, to Max, and this would have been sometime in 2023 that happened. And at the time, we were both listening back to a podcast we did in 2022 when they announced this strategy. I definitely opposed the strategy of unifying. I really questioned whether the Discovery content would help with Max in getting it to grow. There didn't seem to me to be much overlap. Well, okay, so let's run forward here to 2025. And they are renaming Max back to HBO Max, which I think is probably one of the... removing the HBO name was one of the most bonehead moves that they've made. Putting it back is probably a good move. But also, quietly, they have been removing a whole bunch of content from HBO Max, which of course they have to do now because they're dividing the company and they're putting the Discovery content in a different company. They've been taking all that Discovery content back out. So basically, we are rewinding the clock on HBO Max, or whatever you want to call it, where we're basically unwinding everything they've done with that product in the last 2 years, except the price increases. So people are now going to be paying the same for less. So really, the strategy with HBO Max and Max has not been a good one, Will. And frankly, I am not hopeful going forward because, of course, the captain and his chief lieutenant are going to be in charge of the streaming side of these two businesses. Zaslav and JB Perret are going to be Zaslav is going to be CEO of the streaming side, and I'm guessing JB Perret is going with him to be maybe the COO. So I'm just wondering if we're going to see more of that type of management of the HBO brand and the HBO content going forward. So I am not very hopeful, even though they're pulling this trick of shifting all of the debt into the global networks division, that this is going to continue to be a very successful business.
So this is the part of the podcast when I say Colin's actually being, I think, extremely modest in his review of what he said back in our March 18th, 2022 podcast that was all about the plan that Warner Brothers Discovery had just announced for how it was going to proceed with the streaming, what its streaming strategy basically was. And they announced essentially a three-step plan that Colin broke down very nicely. First was that they were going to bundle the apps at a discounted price, which very plausible, good move. Okay, great. We can all agree to that. Second was that they were going to converge the tech stacks that each app had been using. So basically put the back end together. That's clearly was a nice synergistic move. It would take them a while to do that, of course, but they were both pursuing similar similar business models, so their tech needs were probably very similar, and the trajectory of their product plans, product roadmaps were probably pretty similar also. Again, a move that makes total sense. But then the third phase, as they laid it out, was that they were going to combine the content into a single app, and that's in fact what they did with Max. And that's where Colin stopped short and said, that move doesn't make sense. And what he said, and I agree with him at the time, was that the fan bases, the audiences for HBO content and for Discovery content were pretty different audiences. And as a result, the likelihood that putting them together, even for an incremental $2 a month, which is all they were going to charge, the likelihood of success of actually drawing overlapping audiences was relatively low. And we just did a very quick common sense check in with one another. At that point, we realized that we were each HBO subscribers at that time, HBO Max subscribers. Would each of us pay an extra $2 a month for Discovery content? And we quickly agreed that neither of us were really Discovery fans, and therefore, even for the measly $2 a month, we were unlikely to upgrade. Now, that led Colin to say, this doesn't seem like a very smart move that they're doing. I, on the other hand, said, I'm going to give these folks the benefit of the doubt and say that with all of the financial resources that they have there, surely they've done some pretty serious market research to figure out that despite our common sense conclusion that yes, indeed, there actually is a market, an overlapping market, justifying putting these two sets of content together. And I was pretty resolute that, like, I'm giving these guys the benefit of the doubt. Well, here we are 3 years later, and they're pulling this content back apart. They're not only doing that, but they're pulling the two companies apart. And I think it's worth noting that there we were with just our measly common sense gut check saying, this doesn't seem right. I was giving them the benefit of the doubt that surely they had research to support this. But after all is said and done, either the research was done improperly or there was no research done in the first place to justify this. And here we are with the whole thing being reversed.
Yeah.
Sobering.
Of course, I guess we should say that David Zaslav in the last 2 or 3 years, how much money has he been paid by Warner Brothers Discovery? 100 million or something?
Over 100 million. I think 120 million or so. It's really sobering. I think it's really sobering what has transpired with these original Time Warner assets during this 9-year period. The amount of value, shareholder value, that's been destroyed, the executive compensation picture, the impact on, Lord knows how many employees who have lost their jobs over this period of time, the detrimental effect that it's had on the future of the companies. That's the other thing, is that they're hardly out of the doghouse right now. They still have to run this business successfully now in the face of, even stronger competition. We just talked about Netflix, but now it's Amazon and everybody else and his brother competing vigorously in the streaming market. So it's just the tally of what's happened here over the last 9 years is really, I think, something to behold.
It is. Looking forward, though, I actually think that there is opportunity for the global networks division. I don't think the global networks division's future is in cable. I think it's similarly in streaming, just as it is for the other side of the house. But I do think that this is going to allow that side of the house to do what will work best for the brands that are going to be in that side of the house. And these are things that are actually going on when this company first came together. I don't know if you remember, but there was CNN Plus. And of course, WBD has announced that they're reversing themselves, that there is going to be a CNN standalone app and subscription package that you'll be able to get. So they've reversed themselves there. They also did something which I thought was very stupid, which was shutting down Filmstruck. Filmstruck was, of course, Turner Classic Movies online presence. Brilliant product. And I think would have done very, very well and helped translate that brand into the streaming world. So I'm hoping to see that they reverse that. I really do think that we'll see global networks do that a lot with the products that it has in its stable. And I could see them also coming up with very interesting bundles of that content. So I think there is some opportunity still for them to do that. And the reason I say that, Will, is as we saw with Jonathan Carson from Antenna, there's lots of opportunity for specialty services. His data certainly shows that there's a lot of growth in the specialty services SVOD area. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for him to do quite well with the brands that that already have a lot of cachet because of the cable era in the streaming world. That said, it's going to be a hard push with all of that debt, particularly when you consider the fact the cash cow, which is cable, is continuing to decrease at 10 or 12% a year now. And so there'll be a lot of diminishment in that revenue that they're getting through licensing of the content to the pay TV providers, supporting their transition. If they had done this from the get-go 2 years ago, we would be in a completely different place, right? We would be in a place where they had really strong brands reflecting the cable brands in the streaming space, and they'd be building up substantial businesses in the same way that companies like BritBox and Curiosity Stream and many of these other specialty brands have been doing.
So this is the point of the podcast where we reverse our positions versus what we were saying 3 years ago, where you were skeptical and I was benefit of the doubt. Now you're in the mode of kind of benefit of the doubt, cautiously optimistic, and I'm going to be the one to express the skeptical tone. I think that the cable networks, that business, especially with the $34 billion in debt that they're going to take on, I think that business is going to be very, very challenging because, we have to remember that the dynamics of the streaming marketplace are such that entertainment is where consumers now consume entertainment through streaming, not through cable. And so those cable networks, like the NBCU networks that are being spun off into the separate company, these Discovery networks, the old Time Warner networks. These are networks that are under the most pressure because they're entertainment and news oriented. Those are places where people have lots of alternatives. And so even if they can do revive Filmstruck and whatever else, those businesses are those networks are in a very competitive environment. They're coming to the party late, as you said. They don't have a unified brand name. Each network is its own thing. And on top of that, cord cutting is going to continue, as you just said, to diminish their established cash flows. So I think that business is going to be very challenged. And I think just one other interesting point of comparison, maybe worth noting at this point, we were recently talking, I think either last week or the week before, about these spin-offs, these cable network spin-offs, and we were kind of saying that we figured Disney would probably follow suit. Bob Iger actually just this week said they're not going to follow suit. Right. They're actually not planning to spin off the networks. And so I think an interesting question is, what is Iger and Disney, what are Iger and Disney seeing in why they're choosing to go against the trend right now, the spin-offs of the cable networks? And I think I haven't really thought this out fully, but I think the big difference is that ESPN and sports is really where the value is in Disney's cable networks group. And sports is, not that it's a layup by any stretch, but sports are in a better position to survive streaming to the extent that the owners of those streaming and cable network sports franchises have the money to keep pace with the rights deals. And therefore, it seems like it makes more sense for Disney to hold on to ESPN, especially now as they're going to launch the new ESPN streaming app with everything included. So it kind of puts Disney in a different position, a more hopeful position, I would argue, for being able to compete going forward than it does when we think about the global networks group that is going to be now separated from Discovery. I don't know if you agree or disagree with that.
Yeah, I think I do, Will. I think there's the other part of that equation, of course, is the kids' content. Disney has been absolutely huge in kids' content on TV, on cable TV for decades. And they're leveraging that content now in Disney Plus, and that has absolutely made Disney Plus a must-have app for parents with younger kids. So, I think there's a lot more synergies there between the cable brands and the cable channels and the broadcast channels, frankly, because ABC content and FX content from Fox are both being used heavily in Hulu right now. So I think there's a lot more synergies there for them with the broadcast content than there is for WBD. That said, it's still not clear that this is a great strategy for WBD. I'll point out a couple of things. One is that right now they are using the streaming versions. So they're using the ad-supported streaming versions of Discovery Plus and HBO Max, whatever we're going to call it. They're giving that to pay TV subscribers, right? They're giving that as part of their subscription and ostensibly not raising prices on people. So what they're really doing there is they're using the streaming properties to support the cable revenue, to try and slow the decline in pay TV. Now, the jury's out on whether that's actually working. I've been watching Charter's numbers, and there was a little decrease in the decline in the first quarter of this year. It's not clear that it's the SVODs that are doing that, but we'll know more in the next couple of quarters. But anyway, where's the incentive to do that if you don't have any cable networks anymore? If you're HBO Max and what you're finding is when you include those in cable bundles that you don't get very many activations that way, and there's some evidence that Disney Plus isn't getting very many activations with the Charter deal, then what's the point in doing that? What's the point in sharing that content? And so, I think that there is some things that will go down because of the split. The make it not clear cut that this is absolutely the right thing to do. I'm just not sure that the entire company's value for shareholders will be maintained by splitting the two companies.
Yeah, I think those are great points. And of course, we're not doing, real financial analysis here to understand what the value of these two companies. In fact, they haven't even released enough information to do that type of analysis yet, but we're not going to be the ones to do it anyway. But I think strategically, your point is right on the money. And, as we're probably needing to wrap up, it might be worth spending the last couple of minutes just in the spirit of what you were just saying, looking ahead and where's all this going for all these different companies. And I'll just start off and say that I think the HBO/Warner company that will have the HBO Max streaming app, I think will do just fine. They're going to be practically debt-free, at least as far as what they've announced so far. They're going to be practically debt-free. They will hopefully be focused, and they will never be a Netflix type company. They will never be a YouTube type company. That scale is just basically impossible to achieve any longer. That game is over. But I think they could be a reasonably successful company. The Global Networks company, as you just said, I'm much more skeptical about. And my hunch is that somewhere not that far in the distant future, these cable networks remainder companies are all going to become private equity owned. And those private equity companies will figure out in their infinite financial engineering genius how to make these remainder companies valuable from a cash flow perspective, whether they consolidate, do some kind of roll up, who knows what. They have a huge bag of tricks, the private equity companies, to figure out how to squeeze value out of companies that still have established businesses but that are in decline.
Yeah. I think that's probably true. The thing for me is what's going to happen with those assets that are used in both places. It's very unclear right now. Look, they just signed an extension for the French Open, which will take it through 2030. And ostensibly that includes rights to stream everything starting next year in HBO Max. And of course, it will continue to be used on the cable channels. Well, I assume that when they signed that deal that they knew that they were going to be dividing into two companies. So I assume that means that both companies gets rights to the French Open, but it's not clear. But there's a whole bunch of other stuff going on, right? HBO Max sports is very important. They're just starting to charge for their sports tab inside of HBO Max, which includes NHL, MLB. Well, and of course, it's losing NBA, but I assume that they'll be replacing it with other stuff. There's also NASCAR in there. So there are a bunch of sports assets that are shared between these two properties. How are they going to get divided up? It's just not at all clear to me how that's going to work in a two-company situation.
I hear you, and those are real strategic and tactical issues. And as we, I think, need to wind up, I just want to make one more quick observation that just came to me on the fly, which is if Netflix is worth about $500 billion and change, and we've recently been talking about YouTube, which a lot of analysts believe if it were a standalone company, would be worth somewhere between $500 and $700 billion. That means between Netflix and YouTube, just those two companies is over $1 trillion of market cap, imputed market cap for Netflix, for YouTube. Over $1 trillion of market cap between these two companies. I would venture to say, and this is not substantiated at all, but I would venture to say that pre-streaming, the entire media industry, every company in the media industry value combined did not reach $1 trillion. That seems like an awfully big number. Look at that, what's happened with the value in the media ecosystem, basically all being transferred into two companies plus. It's pretty breathtaking to think about that way, isn't it?
It is. But you know what, Will? Back in 2000 and when was it? 2007, 2008, I had a debate with Craig Moffat, and one of the things I said in that debate was that Craig was he was really behind the cable model. He thought would continue to exist, and I said it's not about what they're doing. It's what the people are doing who are outside of that model. And guess what? You just talked about two companies that have existed outside of the cable model, and they are worth way more than what's left of the cable model, and probably what it was at its peak.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say in defense of Craig, who's a good friend, he's made a lot of really great calls, and I wasn't exposed to your conversation. But back in 2007, there was ample reason to still be, relatively optimistic about the cable business. Nobody in 2007, could have forecast that Netflix at some point would be worth $500 billion. That would have been an absolutely obscene forecast. Even Netflix would have never thought they were going to be worth $500 billion. So,
perhaps.
There's a lot of, I think, maybe hindsight on that one. But here, here's where we are. I mean, it's an industry that's been absolutely thoroughly disrupted. And two companies, YouTube and Netflix, have gotten the lion's share of the new value that's been created.
Indeed. On that point, we're probably just about done for this week.
I think we are. So, Colin, great chatting. Again, kudos on your foresight back in 2022. I think one of your finer moments in breaking things down. And, for listeners, if you have comments or feedback, let us know. But I think that's all we have for this week. So thanks for tuning in.
Inside the Stream is a production of In-Screen Media and Video News, all rights reserved.